Participants, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our fourth web conference. And together with Lord Dubbs, I'm very glad to chair it. I'm also grateful to the House of Lords for hosting this web conference and to the staff of Parliament for connecting us all online. Our series of conferences started on the 19th of June last year when the coronavirus compelled parliamentarians in Europe to work much more online. And as we now come out of the lockdown, though increasingly we have learned to appreciate this new way of meeting online and discussing politically important matters with experts from very faraway locations throughout Europe and beyond. New technologies enable us to bridge long distances online. And for migrants and refugees, those distances are, of course, real challenges and often deadly ones. And this is why we meet here today. When Sir Winston Churchill called for the creation of the Council of Europe in 1946, millions of people had been displaced in Europe. That unprecedented scale of human suffering initiated the drafting of the United Nations Refugee Convention in 1951, which sees its 70th anniversary this year. And on that special anniversary, it's particularly appropriate to reflect on the human suffering endured today by refugees and displaced persons, as well as by migrants who risk their lives in the Mediterranean Sea, in the English Channel, or in lorries crossing European borders. Governments have legal obligations to respect fundamental rights, but all of us bear the moral responsibility to help others in distress. We've structured this conference along three major aspects: the 1951 Refugee Convention in today's world, the need to rescue migrants in distress at sea, and the relocation of refugees and migrants in need of humanitarian protection. For each session, we are fortunate to have distinguished speakers. After each presentation, there will be time for contributions from the floor, and for that, each contribution during the discussions should be limited to 2 minutes. If you want to take the floor, could you please raise your finger electronically or type into the chat window on your screen your name and indicate during which session you wish to speak. You can see the chat icon or button on the right-hand side of your computer screen, or possibly at a different place, depending on your computer. Unless you are given the floor, could you please switch off or mute your microphone? Otherwise, Parliament staff could close your microphone remotely in case you've forgotten to do it. With your approval, the conference will be recorded and the video will be made available publicly on the internet after the conference. To begin with, it is now my pleasure to ask the Earl of Kinnoul to formally open the conference. He is Principal Deputy Chairman of Committees and Chairman of the EU Select Committee of the House of Lords and a strong supporter of humanitarian action. Lord Kinnoul, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Dundee. And could I add my welcome to everyone here to the virtual House of Lords, something which we've known about now for the last 15 months or so. In this fourth in the series, I've been to well, all four of the meetings, and what I'm constantly amazed about is how that the theme of protecting refugees and especially children is so broad that there is something new and fresh and important in every one of these sessions. There can have been very few blessings that have come out of COVID, but in fact the virtual world and the way in which we can meet today is certainly one. And I reflect that today we have speakers from Greece and from France and from Austria and from Switzerland and from Belgium, let alone from Scotland and England. And and that richness and that ability to get speakers of great weight and experience means that this type of conference is very much the better, oddly, for the virtual world. And we're certainly going to fold that into how the House of Lords will operate going forward as a legislature. turning to today, I do feel that the Refugee Convention is 70 years young and not 70 years old. I was reflecting with, we have 3 teenage daughters, I was reflecting with them last night about what I was doing this morning. And I pointed out that this was the first time internationally that there was a definition agreed by many countries, today almost 150, of the word refugee. And that again, there was a codification internationally of the rights of people who'd been granted asylum. And I have to say that they were dumbfounded that in the civilized world, that such an international agreement was only 70 years old. And it led me to reflect how precious it is to have this agreement and how important it is to celebrate the anniversary and to continue the dialogue and conversation about it, because things can always be tweaked for improvement as things change, and the world is immeasurably different today to what it was 70 years ago. And of course, that dialogue and that continuing discussion takes work, which brings me to the 2 co-chairs today, Lords Dundee and Dubs. They're very much the warriors of our House in this area. It is impossible to overstate the esteem in which they are held among my colleagues and the reputation that they jointly have for integrity, for energy, and for determination in this very important area. And it is really very much a privilege to be their colleague in the House of Lords, and why I'm particularly happy to be here today. But I close in wishing the deliberations this morning and this early afternoon well, and say that I'll be listening hard, because it's a rare gathering of great minds and people of expertise to discuss.
Ja.
Thank you very much.
Ja, wirklich. Ja, ich bin mal gespannt, wie sie es bei uns im Umsetzen sozusagen, weil ich habe ja schon mit einem mobilen Arbeitstag, der fällt ja eigentlich da nicht.
Thank you very much indeed.
Dann könnte ich so weitermachen wie in Corona-Zeiten. Einmal
alle Mikrofone ausmachen.
Also ich gehe auch gern 2-mal die Woche, aber ich finde es ja toll, dass wenn man... Das wäre super. Also dann könnte man noch Tage sagen, Donnerstag sind alle da. Mal sehen, wie sie es machen.
Könnten Sie Ihr Mikrofon bitte ausmachen? Können Sie Ihr Mikrofon bitte ausmachen, Herr Grimm?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed, Lord Cannul, also for hosting this conference by the House of Lords. We now have the pleasure to hear the United Kingdom Minister for Middle East and North Africa. Unfortunately, due to another commitment, James Cleverly cannot be present in person, but he's recorded his message to us, which we can hear now.
Noble Lords, distinguished guests, on the eve of World Refugee Day and the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention, we reflect on the strength and courage of those forced to flee their home country to escape conflict or persecution. And as a government, we underline our commitment to the Refugee Convention and to supporting refugees and other forcibly displaced people. By combining the UK's humanitarian expertise and diplomatic clout in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, we are now better placed than ever to couple effective aid and political pressure to address the plight of refugees around the world. Whilst there will always be calls for us to do more, we also remain one of the largest humanitarian donors in the world. This year, we're providing a further £205 million to support those forced to flee from Syria, which takes our total commitment to those displaced by the conflict to over £3.7 billion since 2012. This has provided emergency relief for over 6 million people, medical consultations for 21 million people, and education and other early recovery support to more than 1 million children. COVID-19 has placed additional pressure on Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon as host countries. So in Jordan, through our Refugee Compact, we are taking the creative approach of supporting both refugees and host communities. We're providing economic support to create jobs and promote trade and investment for host communities, which sits alongside our humanitarian support for the refugees themselves. In Bangladesh, there are now close to 900,000 Rohingya refugees who have fled Myanmar. We recently announced an additional £27 million to support them, bringing our total contribution to over £320 million since the start of the crisis in 2017. This new funding will deliver life-saving food, health services, water and sanitation, as well as protection for survivors of gender-based violence. We continue to support efforts to deliver justice for the Rohingya and a political solution that allows them to return to Myanmar safely, voluntarily, with dignity, when conditions allow. Now, focusing on our actions in support of refugees at home, the UK is one of the world's leading refugee resettlement states, and this government is committed to providing safe and legal routes for those refugees most in need of protection. Since September 2015, we have resettled over 25,000 vulnerable refugees in the UK, half of whom were children. We take a long-term and holistic approach to refugee assistance and protection, which restores their dignity and offers them a viable future. Our comprehensive support package enables many to move forward and contribute to society by learning the language, getting involved in the local community, and by studying and working. Our groundbreaking community sponsorship scheme also enables communities to play a direct role in welcoming refugees. World Refugee Day highlights the rights, needs and dreams of refugees. We all have a duty to stand with them, and the UK government will continue to pursue a comprehensive approach. We will work to resolve conflicts through our diplomacy and our alliances. We will respect the Refugee Convention and the rights of forcibly displaced people. We will continue to resettle vulnerable refugees in the UK and support them as they adapt. And we will continue to be a leading donor of humanitarian support for refugees around the world.
Thank you very much, Minister Cleverly. This leads us to our first main session on the 70th anniversary of the UN Refugee Convention. We are honoured to have with us Mrs. Gillian Triggs, the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Assistant High Commissioner for Protection in Geneva. She has already visited several countries and seen for herself the unanswered needs for protection of so many people. In a recent Council of Europe report, I've emphasised the humanitarian needs of migrants and refugees in North Africa and the Middle East, which has led to Resolution 2380 of the 28th of May this year. Coming originally from Australia, a Commonwealth country, Mrs. Triggs was President of the Australian Human Rights Commission and Dean of the Sydney Law School. Thereby also, she is well aware of the legal aspects of refugee protection under the 1951 Refugee Convention. Mrs. Triggs, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Lord Dundee, and thank you to all involved in arranging this conference through the House of Lords for the opportunity to be with you for World Refugee Day and to recognise the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention and to consider its achievements and its challenges. In 1951, the founding nations of the Convention were concerned to protect at that time about 2 million people who remained displaced and without protection 6 years after the Second World War. Today, as we celebrate the 70th anniversary, the UN Refugee Agency has a vastly increased mandate, covering, as we've announced today, more than 82 million refugees and people displaced in their own countries, plus unknown millions of those who are stateless. The Convention and its 67 protocol define who is a refugee and sets out the protection, assistance and social rights a refugee is entitled to receive. For its time, a revolutionary agreement in recognizing social and economic rights of refugees. The Convention rests on two fundamental principles: the right of everyone to seek and enjoy asylum, and the absolute prohibition on returning a refugee to a place of violence or persecution. Today, 149 states are party either to the 51 Convention or to its protocol, or both, reflecting what I think is fairly to be said a global consensus on these humanitarian values that now have a customary law status and are binding on all nations. But of course, the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention is a time for reflection. What has the Convention achieved? And is it able today to respond effectively to the challenges that those forcibly displaced face? And will it do so in the years to come? First, it's undoubted that the commitments to the Convention have saved, over 70 years, millions of lives, even in this time of COVID. There are currently 26.4 million registered refugees hosted in countries around the world, a testament to those governments that have endorsed the Convention, both in word and in deed. Despite the need for measures to protect public health, most states have ensured that their borders
Excuse me, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry, it's become muted. I hope we didn't miss too much. But my point is then that the Convention has been successful in saving lives, and it's also inspired new agreements, such as the 1969 Organization of the African Union's Refugee Convention and the Cartagena Declaration of 1984 for Latin America, and of course the Common Asylum System for the European Union. Secondly, I'd suggest that the Refugee Convention has shown itself capable of responding to contemporary challenges. But before you say I protest too much, let me also be quite straightforward in acknowledging the significant challenges to the Convention, to its norms and to its effectiveness. First of all, we have many states during COVID using the health pandemic to impose disproportionate measures that do restrict access to asylum, with nearly 100 countries not only closing their borders, but denying exceptions for refugees or asylum seekers. Nearly 90% of refugees are hosted, in fact, by poor or developing neighbouring countries, typically in the global south, while relatively small and manageable numbers find their way to Europe and other safe havens. Many refugee determination processes are weak, resulting in backlogs over many years. Those asylum seekers found not to be in need of international protection are all too often not able to be returned to their country of origin, undermining the integrity of the asylum regime and indeed undermining public support for it. Some states push back asylum seekers at their borders or at sea, while others deny disembarkation of asylum seeker boats. Many leaders conflate migration with asylum seekers and refugees for political advantage. And some countries seek to transfer their protection obligations to other, usually poorer nations, even to isolated islands, detaining asylum seekers in poor conditions indefinitely. COVID has also reduced the opportunities for resettlement, so that last year, the UN Refugee Agency was able to submit for resettlement fewer than 23,000 people, though we hope that with the subsiding of COVID and certainly the return of the United States to the resettlement program, these numbers should rise in 2021. But also many conflicts are protracted, meaning that voluntary repatriation, which is what most refugees want, is impossible. And we, of course, recall the Afghanistan conflict now entering its 5th decade, Syria its 11th year, continuing tragedy for the Rohingya people leaving forcibly from Myanmar and hosted so generously by Bangladesh, as has been mentioned, but newer conflicts in Ethiopia and most recently, of course, in Mozambique. So the question is, how can the Refugee Convention respond to these challenges? And one answer lies in the Global Compact for Refugees, accepted in 2018 by, again, an overwhelming majority of states. 181 countries accepted this compact. It's a breakthrough, it's legally non-binding, but it's readily accessible. It's written in plain English, under which states agree that they will share equitably the responsibility for refugees and those forcibly displaced. States agree that not only are they responsible equitably for sharing the needs of refugees, but that the wider international community, civil society, NGOs, the business sector, parliamentarians, faith groups, scholars, city mayors, all are now committed to the objectives of the Compact to support host nations and to enable refugees to be self-sufficient. These are more, I'd suggest, than abstract ideals. They must be implemented through the more than 1,400 pledges made by governments and civil society in 2019. Their impact will be assessed by evidence and data. It's no longer enough just for the words or for the pledges. And in December this year, we at the UN Refugee Agency will be holding a high-level officials meeting in Geneva to take stock of what has actually been achieved. The Compact, of course, builds on the principles of the Refugee Convention, and we hope will turn concrete measures into practice. The COVID pandemic has taught us many lessons, and one is that pandemics are no respecters of legal status. Refugees must now be included in national health care and have access to vaccines, to work, to education, and to social safety nets. I fear that the COVID-19 pandemic will leave a social economic legacy that may continue to have a disproportionate effect on the most vulnerable, especially those forcibly displaced. Priority for the future, or a priority, and maybe the number one priority, will be the impact of climate change and natural disasters as a multiplier effect in forcing the displacement of people, driving them from their lands to seek better pastures, access to water and to food. Many will flee across national boundaries to seek protection in other countries. And these are situations where the definition of a refugee under the Convention could well apply. People may have a valid claim for refugee status, for example, where the adverse effects of climate change interact with armed conflict and violence. In addition to the Global Compact is the proposed EU Compact, or Pact, on migration and asylum that presents another opportunity for concerted regional action rather than unilateral initiatives that push the challenges posed by refugees onto others. The Pact calls for European solidarity, one of the reasons for our meeting, and we look forward to those discussions. Well, I've mentioned the role of parliamentarians as stakeholders in the Global Compact, and this is for good reason. Parliaments and parliamentarians have the power to pass laws and budgets to preserve access to asylum, to facilitate refugee integration, and to address root causes that give rise to the displacement in the first place. 2 weeks ago, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution and published a report that encourages European parliamentarians to implement the global compacts on refugees that I've mentioned, but also on migration, and to address root causes, to build stronger institutions, and to promote good governance in countries of origin. The report reaffirms the strategic role played by refugee protection and in ensuring solutions. It's a tangible demonstration of European solidarity. At the UN Refugee Agency, we're working in partnership with the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen international parliamentary democracy. And we hope that over time, the Compact on Refugees, grounded in that Refugee Convention from 70 years ago, will promote equitable responsibility sharing and re-energize the long-honored right to claim asylum and to non-discriminatory access to livelihoods, freedom of movement, and ultimately to sustainable safety and protection. So may I conclude by observing that the most effective way to ensure refugee protection lies in practice, in implementing the commitments of the Compact and the Convention itself in practice. And in this way, we at the UN Refugee Agency warmly welcome the call to action by the United Kingdom Parliament as stimulated by this conference. Thank you very much, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Triggs, and also for your work at the UNHCR. Before we come to questions and the discussion, I'd like to give the floor to Mrs. Agnes Callamard, the new Secretary General of Amnesty International. Having worked with, inter alia, the Toronto Centre for Refugee Studies, she was Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary or arbitrary executions of the UN Human Rights Council. In this capacity, she's already informed my Council of Europe committee about the plight of missing migrants, having died on their migration route, often unnoticed and undocumented, leaving their families in uncertainty and grief for years. Amnesty International has raised its voice for the politically persecuted for 60 years now. Mrs. Callamard, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you on this very important occasion. On the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Convention, I certainly wish there will be far more reasons to celebrate. I think that the fact that it has endured 70 years of major refugee crisis is a major achievement, and we have heard previously how much that convention has achieved in that regard. However, that the poorest countries in the world have consistently provided disproportionately safety to millions should give us some pause to reflect. That the richest countries in the world are increasingly renegating on their responsibility should be a major cause of concern. Extraterritoriality or externalization, militarization, including through pushback, and criminalization of solidarities have become central pillars of controls of refugee movement of most Western countries. It's violating the 1951 Convention and many human rights obligations. Let me highlight some of those concerns. The externalization or outsourcing is certainly a very widespread practice, unfortunately, including in Europe, which is undermining the global refugee crisis by outsourcing refugee protection and border control to third countries. For instance, since 2016, cooperation with the Libyan Authority has played a central role in the European strategy aimed at stemming arrivals to Europe by sea. Disguised as assistance to life-saving operations, the support provided to the Libyan Coast Guard aims at containing people in Libya. In 5 years, around 70,000 people have been intercepted by Libyan Coast Guard in the central Mediterranean and returned to Libya to face arbitrary detention in abysmal conditions, exposed to torture, ill treatment, rape, extortion, and forced disappearance and killings. And the UN has provided multiple evidence of the violations committed against refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants by Libyan authorities, including Coast Guard. Most recently, Denmark has introduced recent amendment to the Danish Asylum Act, which includes the possibility to forcibly transfer asylum seekers to a third country for the processing of asylum claims, something that, as we know, Australia, among others, has been doing for years. This could result, in the case of Denmark, in breaches of the European Convention on Human Rights and, of course, of the principle of non-refoulement, which is so central to the 1951 Convention. Denmark's proposal also erodes the principle of responsibility sharing of the refugee regime, as it is yet another example of a rich country paying its way out of international obligations. Let me be very clear that where state of destination found government in state of transit to arrest, detain, or return asylum seekers, the state of destination violates the 1951 Convention and may bear responsibility for aiding and abetting in any resulting human rights violations, especially now when the egregious practices in some of those states, such as Libya, are well publicized and known. The state of destination, and that includes all of Europe, cannot feign ignorance and escape responsibility for practices they are in effect funding, practices which amount to violations. Let me give you another example of concern, which have been mentioned previously, the pushback, often part of an overall militarization of border controls. These have become an intrinsic feature of many migration and refugee policies, including, again, in the European context. For instance, in Greece, Amnesty International has documented for nearly a decade now the widespread practice of pushback of refugees and migrants from Greece to Turkey. In February 2020, in response to Turkey's decision to open its borders, Greece's border forces pushed back asylum seekers and employed excessive force, and including live ammunition. In Croatia, the authorities have employed what appears to be a systematic and deliberate practice of collective expulsion and pushback of asylum seekers and migrants. Pushback are violent, and in some instances, asylum seekers and migrants have been brutally beaten, tortured, humiliated. Thousands of people routinely end up being sent back outside of EU's border to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia, countries with inadequate and under-resourced asylum system and abysmal reception conditions. Such pushback are part of a broader policy of militarization at the border, which transforms refugees into the enemy and suggests to officers that they can act like soldiers dealing with enemy combatants. Such tactic to repel or scatter refugees, both on land and at sea, purposefully put asylum seekers in conditions where their lives are at risk. In addition to violating the fundamental principle of non-refoulement, pushback are essentially premised on creating or increasing risk, and therefore violate a state obligation to exercise due diligence to protect the right to life against foreseeable risk. At times, these policies and action may be so purposeful in endangering the life of asylum seekers that the state may be deemed to have failed to respect their right to life. In either event, there are substantial grounds for concluding that if asylum seekers or migrants die as a result of pushback, the death of refugees along migration routes constitute arbitrary death for which states are responsible. Let me highlight a third concern as we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. And it is a concern that touches at the heart of the values of that convention, the criminalization of solidarity and life-saving activities. Solidarity and compassion have been turned into a crime across the world, including Europe. People who have helped refugees and migrants have been investigated, charged. Some have been convicted just for providing assistance, for saving lives, for monitoring human rights, or standing in solidarity with refugees. Authorities have used a range of tactics to target those human rights defenders, misusing anti-smuggling laws to curb solidarity and assistance, even though the smuggling protocol itself exempted humanitarian act to protect the rights of migrants. Authorities have misused administrative requirement to seize rescue boats, resorting to smear campaign, imposing fines, harassing volunteers, providing food and water to destitute people. States are even criminalizing families, helping other family members. From a human rights standpoint, let's recall that a state has a positive obligation to provide life-saving services to the maximum extent possible, which includes all resources from the national and international community. An essential corollary of this obligation is that when a state is unwilling or unable to provide these services, it must agree to and facilitate such services by others, including private actors, humanitarian actors, individuals, and it cannot lawfully impede them. Saving lives is not a crime. Feeding starving people is not a crime. Providing shelters to families in need is not a crime. These are fundamental values. In conclusion, we are taking stock of the 1951 Convention on a continent that is turning its back on it, and in a country whose latest plan on asylum would fundamentally renege on its responsibilities. The March 2021 proposal by the British government will not stop refugee migration, including across the Channel, but it will increase the dangers and exploitation that many refugees face. The March 2021 plan proposes to introduce a differentiated system of access to its asylum system, and if access is permitted, to differentiated standard of asylum for those entitled to it. That, needless to say, is a violation of the 1951 Convention. The UK is also proposing to legislate to apply a higher standard of proof for recognition as a refugee. That too is a fundamental violation of the 1951 Convention. Those steps will directly conflict with international legal obligations, undermine the international system of protection, which rests upon cooperation, shared responsibilities, and implementation of the 1951 Convention. Across the globe, people and communities are reacting to these negative trends, finding concrete ways to show their solidarity towards refugees. Some do it outside formal schemes and at times in violation of domestic law. Others do it as part of formal scheme. Over the past few years, Amnesty International on 4 continents have been working to support refugees, increasing the number of people who can start their lives in a safe country through community sponsorship, which allow ordinary citizens to assist refugees in reaching safety and settling in new countries. By so doing, we are joining a global community that is seeking to change the conversation, the discourse about people seeking asylum, even in the most hostile of environments. We are part of a community that is living and enacting the principles and values at the heart of the 1951 Refugee Conventions. We are part of a community that is living and implementing a fundamental principle at the heart of the 1951 Convention, the principle of responsibility sharing. I would like to end by reminding us all that projections for the future indicate an increasing number of people on the move, fleeing conflict or climate crisis, possibly leading to over 200 million each year by 2050 in need of humanitarian assistance. A significant proportion of them will seek asylum or safety outside their countries of origin. Whether the Refugee Convention can survive this decade, can survive those violations committed on a global scale by countries that should show examples, that can only be determined by what we do, by what the parliamentarians do, by people who remember that in a world of crisis and challenges as ours is, the protection of asylum seeker is as fundamental as the air we breathe. And it could well be our own protection that we are seeking to safeguard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Kallamar. Now I open the floor for contributions from everybody and for questions to Mrs. Trigg and Mrs. Kallamar. Lord Griffiths may have joined us. He is the Council of Europe Rapporteur on the 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention. Lord Griffiths, I think you may have a question, and if so, I now give you the floor.
Am I heard? Good, thank you. I can only thank the two contributors who've opened this day of study for their trenchant and honest and transparent remarks. They have saved the process of unmitigated celebration of this anniversary by injecting a note of realism that we must all take care of. So I want to say thank you to both of them. I'm the rapporteur for the Council of Europe putting together a proposal that will come before them later this year. And you have now challenged me as to the best way of ensuring that the document doesn't become anodyne. So all I want to ask by way of a question is, what might you do as very personal to help me to be sure, I'll be in touch with you, don't you worry, to be sure to get this angle of view clearly stated in the report that I'm in the process of compiling. I can go on, Chair. I mean, I can go on, but that was my question.
Thank you very much, Lord Griffiths. I wonder if either Mrs. Triggs or Mrs. Kallamar would wish to respond. Mrs. Triggs, perhaps I ask you first if you would like to reply.
Thank you very much, Lord Dundee, and thank you, Lord Griffith. I could see you on the screen listening, and I'm really delighted to meet you, albeit remotely, and to know that you are in this process of drafting. I'm sure Agnes will be equally pleased by your invitation to assist. I know I speak for all my colleagues at the UN Refugee Agency, that we stand ready at any time to work with you on this. I think that's why I tried in my own presentation to balance what I know have been the huge achievements of the Refugee Convention, but at the same time, we have to understand where laws are taking us in the future. And if I may say so, Agnes has set out the very serious concerns that we have. In particular, if I may say, I wouldn't say it's the trend, but some indications of following an externalization model, which our High Commissioner has been quite strong in saying is a sort of post-colonial approach, that we simply move to very poor countries in Africa the responsibilities that lie with we will be very to find the balance, because we need to bring parliaments with us. We need to bring the public with us to understand what the values of the Refugee Convention have been, the extremely generous response through Europe, both to the UN Refugee Agency and to support for refugees over many, many decades. So we want to make sure that message is clear, but we also want to talk about the challenges. So if I may, I'll pass back to Lord Dundee to go forward to Agnes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mrs. Kallemeier, would you like to add to that?
Equally, very, very happy, Lord Griffith, for Amnesty International to be providing every support we can as you are developing this new framework and policies. You know, we will stand with you and seek to enrich, if it's needed, your recommendations. You know, I think both Mrs. Triggs and I, and we did not consult each other, but I think it's interesting to see that both of us are really want to be positive on this 70th anniversary, because what was done in 1951 was a major achievement, and it has played a very important role. But we need to really rise to the challenge that we are confronting, that an increasing number of states are renegating on their responsibility. They are creating domestic lawful practices, supposedly lawful, that violates the principle at the heart of the 1951 Convention. And at the rate we're going, given the challenges we are confronting, Mrs. Triggs mentioned climate refugees, among others, the system is not fit for purpose. The system will not be fit for purpose if we cannot protect one of its fundamental pillars, which is the 1951 Convention, and add on to it. You know, at a time when we are seeing more and more countries moving away from multilateral effort and violating principles of burden sharing and responsibility sharing, that is particularly worrisome, because the world is in need of more of it, not less of it. So I would like to invite you and maybe us all to think of ways that we can, you know, demonstrate. I mean, I don't know what else we can do, that the selfishness of national policies at the moment is bringing us all to a disaster. And that the only way to proceed in a world confronting such challenges is through a collective global approach, and one that recognizes that responsibilities must be shared, that it must be shared fairly, and that particularly rich countries have an important, if not fundamental, role to play. So I'm not offering solutions, but I want, you know, I think if we put our head together, and there is a refugee complex mentioned, and, you know, I absolutely will in the name of Amnesty International, will offer all of our support.
Je vous remercie toutes les deux.
Thank you very much. I now call on Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, who has a...
Thank you, Lord Dundee. Can you hear me? First of all, thank you very much for chairing today's event and the amazing amount of work you've done on all of this. My issues are really twofold. One is I agree with what's being said about the way in which there's an increasing tendency of outsourcing refugees. Australia has led the way on this and others, and it is utterly appalling the way that refugees are effectively criminalized onto remote islands in various places and stay there presumably without any obvious means of ever leaving them. But secondly, the hostile environment that has been created in many Western European countries, not least in this one, has led to cuts in benefits, cuts in allocation of housing allowance, extreme poverty amongst asylum seekers, and those that have not been successful at their initial application then end up being virtually destitute on the streets of major cities all over Britain. And the media keeps saying that the important thing is to have the Navy in the Channel to stop any other refugees coming. And it's a horrible narrative against people who are desperate and actually want to make a decent life for themselves and want to contribute to our societies. And so I hope that in this anniversary year, there won't be a lot of self-congratulation going around. Instead, there'll be a recognition of the massive contribution that refugees have made to all of our lives all over the world, and that the human response has to be one of recognizing their human needs rather than putting them through, in the case of this country, often years of a sort of purgatory existence when they don't know whether they're coming or going. My own constituency has people in this situation, and I just feel constantly angry about the way in which they're treated and diminished as humans by the way in which society as a whole reacts to them. But that's not to say there aren't amazing elements of support from community groups, voluntary groups, trade unions, church groups, and so on for refugees. But can we just try and use this year to change the narrative? In different circumstances, any of us on this call could be a refugee. It does happen to almost anybody. Let's have some humanity about it and stop this horrible demonization.
Thank you very much. And would first Mrs. Trigg wish to respond?
Thank you very much, and thank. I'd like to just make one point, because you've made a number, but in the interest of time, that is really why I'm so pleased to be part of this event now, because we are really focusing on the significant role that parliamentarians can play. We feel at the UN Refugee Agency that it's leadership and political will that's going to make the difference, or at least a significant difference. And so parliamentarians have, in democracy certainly, have that capacity. They pass laws, they can speak up, they have a public voice, and they have power. And we feel that that leadership can change the narrative and can try to explain and put things in perspective. And perhaps I can finish by saying I've just in the last few weeks come back from both Mozambique, where we have 1 million people displaced from Cabo Delgado, looking for some kind of protection and finding it very, very difficult to do so. But also I visited Turkey, hosting 3.6 million refugees, and Bangladesh hosting 1 million Rohingya at Cox's Bazar. And I think we need this point about global sharing is important where we understand relatively what the threats are. And it seems to me that Europe has been the leader in recognizing asylum and the rights. And I think parliamentarians and the House of Lords can play a very, very powerful role in retelling the story and bringing us back to those core values of 1951. Thank you very much. Back to you, Lord Dundee.
Many thanks. Mrs. Kalama, would you wish to add to that?
I agree with Mr. Corbyn and with Mr. Triggs. We need to. There is much that needs to be done in terms of how we speak of refugees and asylum seekers. We are confronting a wave of so-called populism, of scapegoating of whoever is different, and that includes in the first place asylum seekers and migrants. It is a tough journey ahead. It is a very tough journey, but that's the only way forward. We need to continue speaking positively about those contributions, and the community approach to asylum is something that we feel it's a small contribution to resettlement. But it is one that governments should encourage. It's one that allows community to come together. It really, transmit a different conceptions and a different approach. The other thing I should add in that context is the fact that governments play a major role, even if even if they do not use language themselves that can be scapegoating. When they adopt policies such as those that criminalize solidarity, that is sending such a terrible message, regarding solidarity, regarding compassion, regarding empathy, and regarding the people who are receiving or should be receiving this assistance. Again, all we can do is stand up and speak and keep speaking up. We cannot let the communication space being dominated by one narrative. We may not have a great impact immediately, but I, for a start, believe that as long as we also occupy that narrative, we also occupy social media, political discourse, we are making, at least we are mitigating the effect of those attacks.
Thank you. May I ask this question? Most forcefully displaced persons remain within their own country, and only a small percentage of asylum seekers are granted refugee status abroad. Mrs. Triggs, why do you think we are witnessing such a heated and emotional political debate about protecting refugees in Europe? And what is the UNHCR doing against this often hateful state of affairs?
Thank you very much, Lord Dundee. And these are the big questions. Of course, those displaced, the 48 million displaced within their own country, typically reflects conflict, violence, and of course the Secretary General has called for peace. But that has largely been ignored, and the numbers continue to rise exponentially. So conflict is a key one, linked, of course, to root causes that we're all familiar with: poverty, degradation of the environment, discrimination, etc. Why so emotional in Europe? Perhaps it's not for me to say, but it seems to me we need the leadership in Europe to speak against that emotionalism. I think, as you can doubtless tell, I come from Australia, and I've seen the reaction of well-meaning public, a public that's always had an open arms to migrants and to refugees. Why do we have a tolerance for such policies of externalization? And we see it now in Europe, and I'm very sad to see that. Why? I think one reason is that the public wants order. The public wants regular pathways. They are compassionate. People are compassionate, but when you see pictures of boats crashing up against rocks, children drowned on beaches, mass movements of peoples, even though the numbers are relatively small in Europe, they're tiny, in fact, relative to other parts of the world. It's those visual images that suggest disorder, mayhem, and abuse. And I think that it's a very human response. So I think we have to be realistic about that. But the way to turn the narrative is, I think, to use leadership to say, this is manageable. We can do this, but we have to do it together, and we won't do it with unilateral policies, which is why, of course, the work that's being done through the Council of Europe and others is so important. And why leadership in putting this in perspective is so important. When, for example, many more arrive on visas in airports than ever arrive informally by boat. But the image, the public image, is that one of disorder. I think we need to push back against the misinformation, but we also need to understand the roots of the public emotional response, because it's real, and there's a need for regular pathways. So we talk a lot at the UN. What are we doing at the UN Refugee Agency? We're trying to keep the resettlement program going, but it's tiny. It's truly tiny. We have 1.4 million of particularly vulnerable refugees, and the United Kingdom has been very generous historically and today in taking numbers and supporting with budgets. So this is not at all directed at the United Kingdom, although we would hope to see they continue to be generous with resettlement. But resettlement is not an answer. Voluntary repatriation is not really an answer. So what is it that we're doing at the UN? We're trying to promote inclusion, because most refugees and asylum seekers are in neighboring countries, typically poor countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. We're trying to encourage and support host countries with financial support, with technical support. But we're also trying to really promote regular pathways, which gets back to my point about the visual image of boats crashing and capsizing. We want to encourage labour mobility, because as Mr. Corbyn has pointed out, refugees and asylum seekers actually bring huge talents and abilities, particularly entrepreneurial, as the research is showing, but also education. I think the point was made earlier about community resettlement programs and sponsorship programs here in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in many parts of Europe, including, I might add, Australia. So we'd like to change the narrative, but perhaps try to understand this phenomenon of the emotional response to what is seen as irregular pathways. We want to stabilise populations, support host governments, and to find the funding through the UN Refugee Agency to support that work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that reply. I now call on Lord Coco. Vernon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lord Dundee. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, everyone, for the contribution so far. I just wanted to make a short contribution, which was really to say how refreshing it is and inspiring it is on a day like this for us actually to be talking about the need to re-win these arguments. Too often we have these discussions and we all agree with each other, and we all say how much more we need to do for the refugees, and of course we do. But there's a battle to be won out there against the populism, against some of the attitudes that all of us on this call don't agree with. And yet we can't ignore them if we're to do justice to the refugees across the world. And I just wanted to pay tribute to all of you for actually discussing it. Sometimes you raise this in meetings and people almost get cross with you as though you're agreeing with the people who are against refugees, whereas actually all of us really want to do more for the refugees across the world, but we also recognise to do that we have to battle against some of the opinions that frankly in some countries, including my own, have some degree of resonance with the general public. I hate saying it, I don't want to say it, but if we just ignore it, then we're not doing justice. So I just wanted to pay tribute, Lord Dundee, to the callers and who've recognised this as a problem, but with a positive view that we are not going to stand for it. We are going to remake the case. We are going to say what we want and the type of society and world and continent that we want. And that vision for the future is the one that has to win out. But isn't it terrible that in 2021, we're having to refight the arguments that I think many of us thought had been won? But certainly that's where we are, and it's so refreshing to be on a conference that's not ignoring the elephant in the room, but is actually saying what are we going to do about it, and we're going to take it on. And I think that's really refreshing. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vernon, for that constructive comment. And before I would ask both speakers to answer, I call on Jeremy Corbyn for another question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, good. Sorry to come back a second time. Just very briefly, a more specific question. The numbers of refugees in Europe are actually very small compared to any other region of the world. Very, very small indeed. And yet there is a wholly disproportionate media attention on them. The massive numbers, particularly in Bangladesh, but also in other countries such as Libya and so on. In the case of Bangladesh and the Rohingya, something that deeply worries me. When I think that the Palestinian refugees went into Lebanon in 1948 and are still there, I have this horrible feeling that the Rohingya that have been driven into Bangladesh by the Myanmar army have no foreseeable future prospect of returning to Myanmar, and they obviously are going to want to lead their lives in the way that everybody else does. Do our colleagues feel there is any political hope of the Rohingya being able to return to Myanmar, or is the strategy for Bangladesh and neighbouring countries to be able to resettle them in the normal way as part of society? Because what I don't want to see is what could become a sort of virtual security zone of refugees in Cox's Bazar for the foreseeable future.
Thank you. Mrs. Callum, I give you the floor.
Well, I think Mrs. Triggs can probably provide the UNHCR and the UN official position. What we can say regarding the Rohingyas is that clearly at the moment the conditions are not met for them to return. So there is absolutely no option there as far as returning to Myanmar is concerned. And even though their location and the conditions of settlement in Bangladesh are not great, and the prospect of permanent resettlement may be remote, and Mrs. Triggs can provide more information on that. There is no other options but to ensure that the population that is currently safe in Bangladesh is provided with all the necessary means so that it can strive as much as possible, from humanitarian project and assistance to education to access to work and so on and so forth. But Mr. Corbyn, at the moment, we cannot be projecting a repatriation to Myanmar. It's just not, it certainly was not the case before the military coup, and it has gotten even worse because over the last, even the last 48 hours, more people, more ethnic groups have been targeted in the context of the actual, expansion of the conflict in Myanmar. So, yes, I agree with you that we do not want to see people permanently, generation after generation, hosted in refugee camps, and we need to do everything we can to avoid that situations, which has been part and parcel of the refugee landscape for decades, but not at the expense of people's life and forced return. But I'm sure Mrs. Triggs has far more to share about what is envisioned at the moment. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Mrs. Triggs, would you like to add to that?
You are muted.
Thank you for the question. It is, of course, deeply troubling. I got back from Bangladesh about 2 weeks ago and spent some time at Cox's Bazar. There are 1 million refugees hosted by Bangladesh. Firstly, there seems to be almost no prospect of voluntary returns to Myanmar. That's not to say that some diplomatic arrangement can be reached in the future, but it's extremely unlikely. Where we are then, and I note the problem that so many refugee groups are still where they were and have been for decades, and we know this is a horrible tragedy for many, most particularly the Palestinians. But the Rohingya have been now held or protected by Bangladesh for the last 4 years. Resettlement is not a realistic prospect. It is, you cannot resettle 1 million people. Last year we resettled through the UN fewer than 23,000 refugees. It's absolutely tiny, and it will increase, we think, but in a minuscule way. And let me put it in perspective. Were we to get an agreement to 20,000 resettlements from Bangladesh in the coming year. That will be a tiny reflection, because 30,000 babies are born a year in Cox's Bazar. In other words, you can't. It's almost impossible. Bangladesh is acutely aware of the challenge it has, because it's a poor country, but it's struggling to move up in the economic rankings. It's proud of its achievements over the last few years, but to take on this responsibility is a huge thing, and we need to support Bangladesh, because frankly, I don't see other options than supporting Bangladesh in its efforts to provide some protection to the Rohingya for at least to this extent we can ever see the future. For the next few years, I don't see any other solution. Thank you.
Yeah. If I may add something, when I started my work and career in refugees, I for about 10 years worked in situations of massive refugee movement, including in Malawi, and at the time the paradigm that was being explored for this kind of situation was refugee assistance and development. There was a real commitment on the part of the international community to integrate assistance to refugees within a long-term development projection for the country of asylum, and to do so through various means, including through a work-related project, investment in local communities so that they do not carry the burden of hosting refugees, investment in education, and so on and so forth. I don't know where we are at with that in Bangladesh at the moment, but clearly we need to, the international community need to provide as much humanitarian but also developmental support. It's not just about emergency support. We really need to invest in that community so that it can work, so that it can go to school, university, and do so by integrating local populations. That to me will be a fundamental step forward, not necessarily a long-term solution, but at least a solution that allows for an easing of the pressure and the betterment of life and prospect and opportunities for people.
Thank you very much again, Mrs. Triggs and Mrs. Kallamar. We all wish you continuing success in your very important work. This brings us to our next session on boat refugees. The arrival of boat refugees on the shores of European states causes enormous political concern, which is disproportionate to the number of people actually arriving. However, all boat refugees risk their life, and many actually lose their life. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe has addressed several times the need to rescue refugee boats in distress. Frontex are active in protecting land and sea borders of the EU and several non-EU states. In this context, they also participate in search and rescue operations at sea. Search and rescue action is also pursued by a few civil society organizations like CI. It's therefore a great pleasure to hear now from Mrs. Sophie Weidenhiller, the spokesperson of CI, who joins us from Vienna. Mrs. Weidenhiller, you have the floor now.
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for inviting me once more. To be honest, it's quite frustrating to sit here and sit at conferences, etc., time and time again, and report on how dramatic and dire the situation in the Mediterranean Sea really is. I wish I could tell you that things have improved, but it's quite the opposite, I'm afraid. We have now 807 deaths to this day, this year alone, which is almost 3 times the deaths that we had during the same time period of last year. So things are still horrible in the Mediterranean Sea. Things are still horrible in Libya, and unfortunately, there is no improvement that I can see of any sort, and no efforts by the EU to really improve the situation. The only thing that we've seen is that the clear focus is on so-called border protection instead of protecting human life, which is quite horrible, honestly. I mean, to see this amount of suffering there, it's quite hard to bear. And also, which is, you know, very hard for me to understand, is that, like you mentioned before, there are efforts directly from the civil society to help in this situation, to fill in this gap that was left by the discontinuation of European search and rescue efforts, which is NGOs who are still trying to help and rescue people from distress at sea, as the law dictates as well, as we all know. And we are still being hindered at every step of the way. And the only sort of new development that we can see now is that last year, the detentions of ships have started and increased, which has resulted in the fact that most ships can't even go on many missions anymore, which I think is part of the reason why so many people have now died this year as well. And what happens is that in Italy, ships are being detained after so-called port state controls with really weird lines of reasoning, such as that, for example, how can we provide adequate waste disposal for 400 people aboard, right? Which is quite absurd, because what we're doing is we're helping in a case of emergency. So we don't even know how many people we have to take aboard. We don't know how many people we will find in distress. And also, the reason why we have to have people on board for a prolonged period of time and not get them to port immediately is because the authorities don't assign us ports, right? So it's quite absurd, and you can really see that this is a political game that is being played, and it's all playing out on the backs of the most vulnerable people, which I think is not the place where politics should take place. It should take place in parliaments. And in a setting like this, and not, you know, directly affect the people who have no way of defending themselves. And as another thing that I would like to mention is, because we often talk about refugees, about migrants, about asylum seekers, but we usually don't talk directly to them or with them, which is what I was able to do since I was on the last mission of CI4, where we were able to rescue 408 people, many minors, among them babies, pregnant women. So the youngest child was 8 months. And I listened to the stories, and what they told us is horrible. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's really quite traumatizing, but we've interviewed women, and for me, the fascinating part of that was that they actually addressed their pleas directly to the EU and to the UN, and they didn't advocate for themselves in their situation, because they were rescued and they knew that they were probably going to Europe. So they didn't urge us to help them in Europe. What they all insisted on was that we need to stop this madness that is going on in Libyan detention centers, right? So they all reported about how horrible it is, and they all told me, please let the EU know how horrible it is in Libya for people being detained there, that there is systematic violence and abuse happening, even to children. And it was really important for the women to convey that message. So this is why I wanted to share that with you as well. And it is, I mean, I don't see any progress being made. Like I said, it's quite the opposite. Rescue ships are being detained. Another problem is, like you've mentioned, Frontex. Frontex is actually directly conducting or co-conducting illegal pushbacks and pullbacks, which is absolutely horrific. And that brings me to my last point. I think that especially during these days, I mean, we should really remember what happened after World War II and how all of these conventions and laws that we created when the European Union, for example, was founded, the Geneva Convention, human rights, etc., etc. Why did we do this? We established this basis of the law to prevent atrocities from being committed or from even being complicit in committing such atrocities. And it pains me to see that today we are violating human rights. We are complicit in pushbacks. We are building camps in Greece. I think that as the European Union and as Europe, we can do better and we must do better. And I thank you all for caring. I mean, obviously you do care about this issue, but caring is not enough. We really have to do something. And I think that it is a joint effort. So we have to work together, but we mustn't sit back and say, well, we'd like to help, but we're only going to help if other countries are willing to help. I think that certain countries who are able and willing just need to start and try and improve the situation. For example, help the southern states, Italy, Spain, Malta, with the distribution of the refugees that come on land there, and also send other means of support, because I think that is the reason why the southern European states are so reluctant to help NGOs and to improve the situation of sea rescue, because they feel left alone and they don't feel enough support. And I think that if they were to get that support, that they would be willing to actually work together with us and help make things better for refugees, because these people, they have been through enough and we really need to take care of them. And that's all for now. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask me anything. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Weidenhiller. Now I open the floor for questions, and perhaps I may begin with this. Mrs. Weidenhiller, CI undoubtedly saves hundreds or even thousands of human lives. Nevertheless, your organization and others are sometimes accused of colluding with migrant smugglers who regularly exploit and abuse so many migrants. What are you doing to help bring migrant smugglers to justice?
Well, to that, I can say that we are in no way in any contact with smugglers in any way, shape, or form at all. And the reason why people have to resort to smugglers and traffickers is because there are no sufficient ways of legally applying for asylum and really having a chance. I mean, oftentimes there are resettlement programs, but they're not sufficient. They're not working very well, from what I've heard in practice. Jeff Crisp, I know, has mentioned this as well. So I think the only reason to truly combat this is to create safe passages and safe routes for people to take, because we are in no way collaborating with any smugglers whatsoever. And we offer support for victims. Of course, there is a helpline that we give out, a telephone number to people if they have been victims of, for example, human trafficking, but we are not cooperating with smugglers in any way.
Well, thank you very much. I think Lord Coker may have a question. I call on Vernon Coker. That may not be the case. And I also have a message which comes that Mr. Corbyn may have a question and Lord Griffiths may have a question. Can I call first on Mr. Corbyn? Lord Griffiths?
You hear me? Yes, good. Thank you for that. Well, I don't know if thank you is the right word. It was, excuse me a moment. Sorry about that. I'm not sure if thanking you is the right thing. It was such a grim picture. But once again, it was unadorned, and we can't but see the picture that you're painting. I guess that as a member of the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, my question really is about how we can make the whole continent aware of Lampedusa and the Greek islands and so on, where you have to direct whoever you pick up, the familiar places, the same places, and yet the spirit of the 1951 convention was all about burden sharing, liberality, and all of that. And Vernon Coker earlier did ask that question. We're not only dealing with the kind of phenomenon you're talking about, but with the attitudes that are currently prevailing throughout Europe at a political level. So that is a huge challenge. It's like turning, well, a maritime image is like turning a tank around in a short space of time. I mean, so the picture is as you've described it, and we're grateful for that. And that's evidence for those of us who have a voice in the world of politics. But are you working yourself to conscientize politicians? I mean, all we get is almost a demonization of people like yourself, and we're in a place that I don't like being in, and yet it's such a huge challenge to change the factors that make the picture that you've been describing. I mean, how do you feel in all of that? Your work is existential, it's every day, it's on the sea, it's looking for people who are fleeing and helping them. So there is that. But there is the bigger picture, of which that's a symptom of a great malaise. How do you respond to some of that? And I'm sorry to put it in that sort of way.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure I quite understood what exactly the question was. Can you maybe give me one?
Well, the question is, how do we work using the evidence that you are providing so graphically to change the minds of and the policies of governments? We've talked about the role of parliaments, but you, do you lobby? Do you try to get inside the mind of those who make political decisions, as well as responding practically to the needs of the people you help?
Yes, so we do try to do that, definitely. The thing is, since we're an operational organization, of course, we have to spend a lot of our resources that are very limited on active search and rescue. However, of course, we are in contact with politicians, especially in Germany, because we're a German organization. So we are trying to do this. And I feel that in some areas and with some politicians, we do have a very good rapport, and I can see that people care and that they want to do something, but I think that it's usually at another level where it fails. For example, I've seen what the Council of Europe, for example, what they've stated time and time again, even the UNHCR, they've, for example, addressed how horrific the things in Libya are right now. But still, for example, Libya is being supported massively financially and with trainings and equipment and everything like that. And I think these are the points where you could really change something. But the problem is, okay, how do we get there? And you mentioned it. There is this general feeling of anti-migrant moods all around Europe, and it's quite disturbing. We are trying. If there's any other way we can be of help, please let me know. I'm always willing to help with that. But yeah, it's a big project for sure. But I do think that it's not about the money, and it's not about not knowing what to do. I think we have many smart people who will come up with good solution, and I do think it's a question of political will, as a matter of fact, which of course has to do also with the people. Because the people elect the politicians as well, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with all you do. Really, seriously.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I will echo that in thanking you so much, Mrs. Weidenhelm, and wishing you all the very best for your continuing work. We now come to the third theme today. This is on migration management and the relocation of refugees. I declare an interest in the latter subject as just now I'm Council of Europe Rapporteur on voluntary relocations, and the finding of this and earlier conferences will flow into that report to be adopted in autumn this year. I'm therefore very glad to give the floor firstly to Mrs. Beata Minder, the Deputy Director General at the EU Commission in charge of migration management. She has run the very successful emergency programme for relocations from Greece. Mrs. Minder, you now have the floor. I wonder, is Mrs. Minder there? Could you ask Karina to chase up Mrs. Minder? Oh, right, yes. I wonder if we might take Mr. Logothetis first then. Could you ask if Mr. Logothetis is online? I wondered if Mr. Logothetis has joined us, who is the second speaker. All right. Yes, yes. Well, that's what they suggest we do. Yes. Okay, for 15 minutes. To be back at 11:15. We are now able to take a short break, and I wonder if hold on. Yes, we now have a short break until British time 11:15, and if you could please come back to your screens then, and you may have time for a quick cup of coffee between now and then. Look forward to seeing you at 11:15. I've just been asked to remind you to make sure that you use the same link to rejoin in 15 minutes time. So it's perhaps we've now got slightly less than 15 minutes because although it's not quite 25 to, it's less than 50 minutes if we were to rejoin at 11:15. Look forward to seeing you then.
Hello, everyone. I'm here now. Beate Gminder. Sorry for having been not immediately available. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Yeah, take care then, Chuck. All right. I'm trying to get back onto this call with this tedious Teams.
Good.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So, thank you for having the opportunity to speak today on such a very important anniversary and on World Refugee Day, which is a very important and commemorable event.
Just to, and thank you very much for joining us. Just before you start, I wonder if I could just check if we are all here. Could, if you would excuse me just one moment, is a message that everybody has rejoined?
I'll just say we're ready to.
Yes, I have a message now come through to say that people have rejoined. And so, Mrs. Minder, thank you. And please address us now.
Yes, you have asked me to give a bit of an experience account of our last relocation exercise, migration management and voluntary relocation of refugees. I'm happy to do so. We have two examples. One concerns Greece and the other one concerns the Central Mediterranean, namely Italy and Malta. These relocation exercises are voluntary. That's important to say, because I think it will easily be able to get into a debate about a mandatory relocation, but this is not the objective today. So relocation is for the Commission and for the European Union an extremely important part of and a key component of solidarity amongst the member states. And therefore, you know, it takes a big and important role in our approach towards migration management. So I give you the two examples that we have been successful with. Let's talk about the positives. One is the relocation scheme from Greece, which we supported from the Commission. It mainly focused on vulnerable asylum seekers and on beneficiaries of international protection. It started with the events at the Greek-Turkish land border in March 2020, where, you know, a mass influx of migrants was moved to the border. Following this, we adopted in the Commission an action plan to support Greece with different support measures, and one of them was the relocation of unaccompanied minors from Greece. So Ylva Johansson, the Commissioner in charge of migration in the European Commission, called on member states to show solidarity and make pledges, and we received 1,600 pledges for unaccompanied minors from 11 member states. Since then, we have actually expanded this group of people to be relocated, because Greece had a difficult year last year, not the first one, but also a difficult one, where on the 8th of September on Lesbos, a fire destroyed the Moria camp. And therefore, in conclusion, we also called again on member states to show solidarity for this very, very difficult situation where thousands of people had within days to be reorganized and put into a new temporary accommodation. And I can see on the screen also Mr. Logothetis, the Secretary General of Greece, who has masterminded this operation. So at the time, the German presidency we called also to show solidarity, and this resulted in an increase of the pledges from 1,600 to 5,200. The scope of the scheme expanded, so we included sick children with family members, as well as families of asylum seekers and beneficiaries of international protection. So a variety of in the group. 16 countries participate into this today. In this scheme, 13 member states, but also Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland. And almost 4,000 persons out of the 5,200 have been relocated under the scheme, despite COVID, I have to say, because of course, Corona made a relocation exercise a lot more difficult. And because a relocation exercise is per se a difficult and complex exercise, it involves many actors, different categories of relocation candidates. And also when you speak about a voluntary relocation exercise, member states express a preference for age, for gender, for the countries of origin, or the status of the asylum seeker or beneficiary. Because, of course, their reception system is geared towards specific categories of people. The actors involved in the process are also numerous. So on the Greek side, we had the Greek Asylum Service, we had the Special Secretaries for Unaccompanied Minors. We had then on the international side involved IOM and UNHCR, both of them. And ultimately, a lot of support was also given by the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, and obviously by us. The Commission has coordinated the exercise, and we also provided funding for this. So this Greek example is for us an excellent example of European solidarity, not only with member states that are under pressure, but also with the most vulnerable people, because we focused on a group of vulnerable migrants and refugees. This aspect of solidarity forms is also an important part of the ongoing discussion on the new European Pact on Migration, which I will come to. Then our second example is the relocations from the Central Mediterranean. So this started during the summer 2018 with pledging exercises coordinated by the Commission at the request of Italy and Malta. So here we focused on the relocation after important disembarkations following search and rescue operations performed by either NGOs or state vessels in the Central Mediterranean. So it's a different approach from Greece, where important pledges were triggered by a willingness to show solidarity following major crises. In this case, in the Central Mediterranean, 4 member states, Italy, Malta, Germany, and France, signed the Malta Declaration in 2019, which established practical solutions in order to respond to the huge migratory pressure in the Central Mediterranean together. So we started this exercise in 2018, we formalized it in 2019, and we have been relocating nearly 2,800 asylum seekers from Italy and Malta to other member states since then. The implementation of this relocation mechanism foreseen by the Malta Declaration and the standard operating procedures have a number of shortcomings. That's where it becomes difficult. Relocations limited to search and rescue related disembarkations are dependent on the pledges from voluntary member states for each disembarkation. So it's done per boat. And member states show a different degree of flexibility in accepting applicants from other or new disembarkations. So we are very much limited to those pledges we get. This makes the process extremely complex and limits also the possibility of fulfilling pledges. Because one of the challenges is that there is a huge number of absconding of people that have disembarked, or we have refusals that they accept relocation. But then you have a pledge and no person to be relocated, which of course is a big pity. The COVID-19 pandemic has made the relocation also more difficult. The process came to a standstill for some months at the beginning of the pandemic. While in Greece, we reactivated it very quickly. It took longer for the Central Mediterranean. It only resumed in May 2020. And the different measures were and restrictions adopted by the different participating member states, as well as all the sanitary precautions needed to carry out safely the transfers, you know, all of it, tests, quarantine, isolation, have introduced additional challenges and provoked important delays in the process. Now we're in the year 2021, and this has started in 18, followed up in 19. In 2021, we can see there has been a significant decrease of member states participating in voluntary relocation and pledges after disembarkation. Since autumn 2020, we have very limited pledges. They're made by a very small number of member states, and we get an average of 2 people per disembarkation. already in this year, in this spring, Italy has accepted so far the disembarkation of 12 NGO vessels with a total of about 4,400 migrants, for which it requested us to coordinate a voluntary relocation exercise. So the pledges we received are far from sufficient, and they didn't exceed in 2021 for vessels in Italy the number of 70, and plus 35 for the massive arrivals in Lampedusa. So a little bit over 100 for over 4,400 people that have arrived. The Commission and the EU agencies are providing and stand ready to continue providing support. We have also helped with funding here again. We have funded IOM with 34 million for this exercise. This funding has not been used to its full extent because of the missing pledges. So in conclusion, we think more pledges and solidarity is required. We continue to call on all member states to continue providing pledges and to completely also to process and complete swiftly the agreed procedures for the transfer of the remaining migrants in line with the voluntary undertakings some member states have been taking. And we're working very hard at political level. My commissioner has been very involved in that, in discussions between Italy, France, Germany on the possibility to resume at a more structural and at a higher pace relocations, particularly in view of the summer and the projected increase of arrivals that we expect over the central Mediterranean. And now a last word on the Pact on Migration Asylum, the way forward in solidarity. We want to make progress on this pact. It remains the only way to agree on a stable and permanent solidarity mechanism for sustainable migration management. The experience shows that the EU cannot continue with ad hoc solutions. It's crucial to make progress on structural reforms to ensure that solidarity by other member states to those member states under pressure remains available and that it also remains predictable. The pact is based on the concept of compulsory solidarity. The main forms of solidarity contributions proposed are relocations or return sponsorship, so that you try to return someone from a member state under pressure, and if that return doesn't happen within 8 months, you relocate that person to your member state. A correction mechanism will ensure that the level of solidarity in the form of relocations or return sponsorships is always adequate. The pact proposes a solidarity mechanism for search and rescue operations as well. This is with a view to provide for a predictable process moving away from the ad hoc boat-by-boat approach and its serious limitations that I have just outlined. It's proposed to set up a pool of pre-committed capacities for the year ahead, based on relocation or contribution in the field of capacity, operational support, or the external dimension. This pool can also apply to vulnerable persons. So we try to make clear to member states in an extremely complicated political debate that yes, the EU will provide solidarity, compulsory solidarity in a variety of forms. But of course, for every member state, there comes along also responsibilities, and we have to find the right balance between those. Thank you very much for listening to me. A positive example, a more difficult example, and an outlook to a continued push necessary for a highly political and difficult debate.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Minder. And before we come to questions and discussions, next I'm very glad to give the floor to Mr. Manos Logothetis. He is the General Secretary of Reception of Asylum Seekers at the Ministry of Migration and Asylum of Greece. Being a member of a Council of Europe subcommittee which visited camps on the Greek island of Lesbos in May this year, I have seen and spoken to migrants there and have already met Mr. Logothetis, who is a medical doctor by profession and has helped many migrants in Greece before his appointment by the Greek Minister for Migration and Asylum. Mr. Logothetis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, my lord. It's been an honor and a pleasure being with you here today to talk about migration. I was actually, and I am still, a medical doctor that was working in a camp in the island of Samos for 4 years of my life. And I was always saying, as I told you in Mytilene, that there is a big distance between people working on the field and people with suits sitting back on their offices and taking decisions on migration. And in a sense, I was honored, but at the same time punished by my prime minister being appointed to be the general secretary of reception. So I moved from the field to the office, wearing a suit and a tie and making decisions on migration concerning Greece. And I'm trying to do my best here with the collaboration and the help of the European Union Task Force with Mrs. Winter as the head of that task force, working under really difficult times and difficult circumstances, trying to tackle a huge issue with multiple parameters that needs to be corrected under an era where solidarity is a little bit lost due to the, let's say, fatigueness of all the people who actually had to deal with the crisis of 2015. So we are at this time when the crisis has a little bit slowly diminished, but still we have inflows. And at the same time, we have the fatigueness of people and member states and different nations to deal with a big number of migrants or refugees moving into the continent of Europe. So, as you know, I talked about a multi-parameter, a really complex situation, since dealing or managing migration means that you have to deal with a lot of things in parallel. It's like a domino effect. You touch one thing, then everything drops down. So it is about reception, and mainly first reception and identification and registration of people. Then you move into an asylum procedure with a lot of time there needed in order to evaluate the application. Then you have the integration part of migration, and of course the relocation or returns part of migration. All these issues were tackled in the past in a crisis mode. And when you tackle something in a crisis mode, there are not a lot of questions being asked, and things are much easier, allow me to say, although you are under a crisis. Currently, this has stopped in a sense, and everyone has stopped and also started to ask more questions. And this makes things a little bit more difficult. But at the same time, it is a golden window to actually re-evaluate what actually happened back in 2015 and why we suffered from all these things that we suffered, and why people that were on the move also suffered during these last 5 years, and to try to establish a better solution as part of a contingency plan, let's say, for another crisis that might happen in the future. So we have a huge experience currently that we need to reevaluate and reassess and actually come up with a conclusion about what will happen next time. And we owe to do that not only for Europe and the member states and all the Europe continent, but also for these people that might actually come in our doorstep sometime in the future. So we have to establish a new mechanism that will deal with all these issues that I mentioned in a better way. Because otherwise we will be left again with another crisis that will come in the future. So this is the time that we in Greece actually try to stabilize things and create, let's say, create like a new, let's say, reality according to the experiences we had. That is why we're improving and we are strengthening our reception system with new camps, with the support financially from the European Commission, and we try to re-establish mechanisms that we can actually better work on the field next time it happens. Because there are a lot of questions why you do that when you do not have people coming in. Because there might be a period in time in the future that people will start to come in again, and then we cannot have another Moria, or we cannot have another case like back in 2015, where people were just staying inside a port area with their own tents, and they were just waiting to be moved forward to another area of Europe. So we try to establish this first reception system in a better way than it was in the past under the experience that we had in these 5 last years. we have worked a lot with our asylum procedures to make them faster and more efficient. And we need to say faster because we actually have to respect that people come to our state and they ask a simple question. I'm supposed to be a recognized refugee or not? And to this simple question, a European state should be able to answer really efficiently, but also actually fast. You cannot keep someone in a limbo state for more than 6 months, allow me to say. We ought to do that. It's a simple question. We ought to give a simple answer and an efficient one. Concerning integration, we never did something in the last 5 years because we had no space to do it, meaning that we were so preoccupied with the crisis of the incoming asylum seekers that we never dealt with integration. We only have one program financed by the European Union called Helios, which actually offers accommodation, some lessons in Greek, and also an assistance to find a job. These are the basic elements of integration, but still they are not enough. That is why my Prime Minister actually appointed a special deputy minister for integration, and we are making a huge effort to establish a new integration system. The only thing that we actually have failed as Europe to work on is actually this thing of returns. It's not only, allow me to say, about relocation, which is really difficult under the times of really fatigueness, as I told you, for solidarity, but it's also about returns in the countries, because where they came from. Why is this so? Because we have to accept that asylum is a procedure. So people show up and ask a simple question. In this simple question, basically, there are two simple answers, yes or no. Yes means that you have to stay in Europe and you have to be integrated for the time that you will be in Europe. No actually means that you should be returned either back to Turkey, or Turkey for our case, but also to another, let's say, last country of entry to Europe, and also maybe to the country where you originate from. And this is really slow. According to our figures, for example, only around something like 3,000 people were returned to their nation, to their country of origin in these last 3 years. So this is a very, very small number. And also, if you go into voluntary returns, which is again another program financed by European Commission, and we thank them for that, but still it is not going as fast as we thought it would go, and it does not have the result that we all hoped it will have, because we give them a lot of benefits to be returned back voluntarily. And we can understand that. Coming from the field, I will have to tell you that if someone has spent like 5,000 or 6,000 euro in order to, through the trafficking mechanism that is responsible for this crisis, is moved to Europe, by giving them back something like 1,000 euro, it doesn't give you the incentive to go back to your country, although 1,000 euro might be a lot for someone returning back to Afghanistan. But the incentive is lacking. So it is only a last response, let's say, if he has lost hope. We have to understand, and by this I will close my initial statement, let's say, that we are talking about this thing and this thing only. We have to face that people are coming with this thing called hope. And hope is something that leaves you last, as we say in Greece. In a Greek statement, this will be really easy to understand. So hope is the last thing that you have, and it leaves you last. So these people have this hope, and also they have a big thing about fake news about this hope. So they have listened to a lot of things telling them that by just crossing to a European member state or to Europe as a continent, they will actually reach paradise during their life. So this is really difficult to tackle, and this is really difficult to fight against. And of course, it might be easy to understand that it is already paradise for them coming from the states that they come from. But this is not, it cannot be a paradise for all, because if this is the way that we deal with this crisis, it means that we will be able to accept millions of people coming. So we have to have a procedure, we have to stick with the procedure, and we have all, as states of Europe, to find a way that we tackle all issues concerning migration management and returns together. Thank you very much. I will be here available to answer any questions that might come and help you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Logothetis. I now open the floor for questions, and I first call upon Mr. Kyriakos Hadiani. Mr. Hadiani, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Cyprus. Here in Cyprus, having continued to receive numerous asylum seekers, particularly through Turkey, and increasing relocations of persons in need of international protection has become an emergency. Our reliance to voluntary schemes has unfortunately reached its limits and has proven an ineffective mechanism for border sharing. I would like to ask the EU Commission representative how negotiations are progressing regarding the new pact, and specifically, what are the prospects for reaching a consensus on a mandatory border sharing among EU member states, particularly concerning situations of pressure or risk of pressure. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Minder, would you perhaps reply to that?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Hadiani, for your question. And indeed, but this is a bit of a Wizard Oz question. Huh? It's negotiations between 27 member states on what I consider the most difficult political file of the European Union, even more complicated than the pandemic management, because there is various parts or groups of countries who have similar positions. There's also the European Parliament, who has also very strong positions. And at the moment, we have not managed yet, in the European Union, when we propose legislation, each of the two arms of the legislative, the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers, have to arrive at a negotiation position. At the moment, for this package of 9 legislative proposals that are part of the pact is de facto 9 legislative proposals. We have only achieved the negotiation positions on one of them. So only on the new mandate of the European Asylum Agency, which we want to expand and where we want to give more competences to, so they can also have a fixed pool of 500 experts that can be deployed anytime in member states like yours to help you with asylum interviews. Only that one has received now a go-ahead for negotiation between the two institutions. This is explicable by many countries wanting to negotiate everything in a package. And the package has proposals that are easier to negotiate, like the one on the asylum agency, like one on improvement of the fingerprinting database for for asylum seekers, but others like what to do in the terms of crises, in crisis situations where we do propose a mandatory relocation scheme between member states. That's a very difficult topic. You know the political debate. You know that some member states are absolutely adamant in not accepting any mandatory relocation. We have proposed that for crisis situations. We have also proposed to change the Dublin regulation with the asylum and migration regulation, which foresees, amongst others, other forms of relocation, other forms of solidarity and the return sponsorship. So these are very heavy things to discuss. And at the moment, there is no position yet by the two individual pillars of the legislative process. So I cannot predict how long this will take. We are very interested in the Commission to move ahead and forward. We are worried that we lose momentum on it, and we're very glad that now in July, we had just last week a meeting of all the ministers in Luxembourg, a physical meeting, and we're going to have one again now in 3 weeks in Slovenia, a physical meeting, because we think that this will help for member states to also come to compromises. Having said that, and we know that in Cyprus the situation is difficult, Your government and your minister and your president have written to us several letters, and I will also myself come to Cyprus still in July to see a bit how the situation is. In a way, you know, in the absence of any legislative reform because of the political difficulties, I think it's very important to make concrete and practical steps by improving the reception system, by improving and working with third countries. And you know how much we at the moment at very high political level work with Turkey, by, you know, improving whatever you can do to have quick returns after fast asylum procedures. And Mr. Logothetis is the best, I think, witness that the efficiency of the asylum procedure that allows people to know their destiny is a key in the asylum management and in migration management, because all the mental health problems come also from having too long time in the waiting room. So you arrive, you have all the hopes which were just described, and then it takes years until you find out that I have to be returned or I can stay. So this is something that is extremely important. On voluntary relocations, you heard my speech. It is difficult, even in the Mediterranean at the moment, to get any pledges. So I don't want to make you false hopes, but I want to also make clear that we and the member states know about the difficult situation in Cyprus.
Thank you. Mr. Logothetis, would you like to add to that?
First of all, I have to say that we really understand what is going on in Cyprus, and this is really hard there, since the thing is, like, Cyprus is an island, and we have to understand that it's not the diffusion of Europe. So in Europe, people that come in have this ability due to Schengen to diffuse. At the same time, in Cyprus, they do not. And we suffer from the same thing, although we have a bigger, let's say, land from Cyprus. So we really stand next to Cyprus, and we stand next to Malta for that same reason. And we have to understand that, especially concerning Cyprus and Malta and Greece, it is a difficult thing. So it is like Great Britain. You are an island and we are an island in Europe, since we have still borders and Cyprus is surrounded by sea. So there is a level on how many people actually can arrive to Cyprus without causing a crisis just by arrival. And there is this issue also, again, about returns, because this is what actually is a huge pull factor. In the world of incoming population currently, they know that just a very small percentage of people will be removed back either to Turkey or to their country of origin. And so they do not actually care that much about the end result. It comes after 2 or 3 years. It used to come after 2 or 3 years, even in very experienced countries like the Netherlands, it comes after a year currently. So you apply and you get a response after a year about your asylum application. And this creates the idea, I mean, the sense in the population that wants to cross over that no matter what, I will be in Europe. So they do not actually care that much. That is why we have to move forward. And I'm glad to hear from the side of Beate that at least for this thing about the common European Asylum Agency, things are a little bit faster than the rest of the parts of this negotiation concerning the new Asylum Pact, because having a European agency means that they will get a response that will be established for the whole of European continent. So the hope of getting another response from a different European country will be diminished, which is also a major pull factor. So I come to Greece, I might get rejected in Greece or in Cyprus, but at some point I might reach Belgium, and then Belgium might give me asylum. Yes, so they are doing, and they are hoping for this capacity of asylum shopping. So we have to establish a mechanism, which is the common asylum agency that gives only one type of asylum concerning all European states. And this will act as, let's say, a procedure that will give a clear answer fast enough, and an answer will be a definite one concerning all member states, which is a huge step forward, and this might help. Okay, so this, I stand next to the Cyprus as a Greek you understand that I'm biased, but still. And of course, they are suffering there because being an island creates a new environment in migration. Thank you, my lord.
Well, thank you very much. And I next call upon Katerina Apostolaki, who now has the floor.
Hello, can you hear me? Can I be heard? I don't know if you can hear me.
Thank you, Katerina. We can hear you.
Oh, excellent. So I just want to ask, do people, when they abscond, know that they could be registered for this scheme? Or do they abscond as soon as they arrive? Could better information upon their arrival help in this regard?
I think it's a mixture of everything. I think some people abscond very quickly because they have friends, they have families somewhere and they would like to join them. And then there are others who, as we heard, because it does take quite some long time until you're relocated sometimes, because the relocating member states, they're doing a security interview with you, particularly from France and Germany. They do, so it takes time to establish your story and your data as well. And then sometimes people are too impatient and do not really know that they're going to be relocated. Well, they know that they're relocated, but they don't know what it means and implies, and try to take their fate in their own hands. But I think in most cases the absconding is because there is a desire to go to a specific place.
Yeah, and it's a matter of capacity, allow me to say, Beate, as well. So when we talk about refugees, we have to understand that we do not talk only about one type of people, you know. So there are many mixtures there. There are different nationalities, different cultures, different financial capacity. So people who have the financial capacity would abscond easier. People who are actually, who have already referred to a trafficking system that is really strong might abscond even more easier. So it's a mixture of parameters again that actually is connected to absconding. So you have people absconding really quickly and you have people waiting there for years and then actually leave the normal way by getting travel documents as we are obliged to give them through the international conventions, and they actually choose to fly to another country after their recognition. But the fact is that there are transit countries and countries that are end destinations, let's say.
And there's of course also the fact, we should be honest, that some people that arrive, they know that they will probably not get asylum. So they've tried to not be registered, not to become part of the asylum procedure.
Thank you. Next, I call on Vernon Coker. Vernon, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Lord Dundee. Can I just first of all say, as I said earlier to some other presenters, how interesting and refreshing the honesty of the contributions that you made, trying to look positively forward and deal with the problem whilst recognising the difficulties that there are. I hesitate to say this from the UK, but can I just say as well to the Commission that it's good to see the way in which you're trying to ensure resettlement works in a way which is effective and practical, notwithstanding the difficulty there is in getting a political consensus. I just wanted to ask, to encourage you both really to carry on with that engagement on political consensus. That is a lot easier to say it than to actually deliver it. But really, I was struck by the colleague from Cyprus, as well as the earlier remarks about Greece and Italy. The context we work within is not only a political difficulty, there is a difficulty of public opinion in many countries. And some of that opinion we would all disagree with and just dismiss. But there is a problem in that many we would regard as middle of the road people, the people who are genuinely quite keen to support and help, have also lost confidence and are concerned and worried. And I just wondered whether what thought has been given to how we try to build back public confidence and public support for the work that is being done to try to deal with a problem that won't go away, whatever people say, how we deal with that. And secondly, whether there are any, so first of all, about building public support and public confidence in what we're doing. And secondly, whether there are any examples of where across the whole of Europe, where you've seen where resettlement, reintegration has been successful and the local population has been able to be taken along with the policy and decision makers. Because frankly, many politicians, and I think this is a challenge to me as a member of the House of Lords and to all of the parliamentarians on here as well, we can't just leave it to those dealing with the problem. We have to speak up and speak out to try and support them as well. So the consensus that's trying to be built across Europe requires politicians sometimes to stand up and say things that are difficult as well. So it's both a question and a comment. So good luck to the work you're doing. It's refreshing to hear the honesty with which you've addressed it, but also the practical ways in which you're trying to solve what is a problem that won't go away. And I just wonder how the resettlement consensus building is going, and whether there are some examples and thoughts about how we rebuild public confidence in the work that so many people are doing with what many are in terrible situations and difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could both speakers possibly reply briefly to that? We've got a little bit more time on this session, but we're slightly running out. Mrs. Minder, could you please reply first?
Yes, I think, thank you very much, Lord, for this question. I think the key is, again, in honesty. I think one needs to tell our societies that there are many people who are in need of protection, and we should give it to them. They deserve it, and we can afford it in Europe to do so. But we also need to be very clear that people who are illegally trying to enter the European Union need to be returned. That's why the cooperation with third countries is so important. So ultimately, you have to show that the system works. The system works for those that have legally and a right to come, and Europe wants to, in fulfillment their Geneva Convention rights, wants to protect them, and those that do not fulfill that would have to go again. And I think it's very important that we make clear that we should enhance legal pathways to the European Union. That's difficult in the EU because it's a member state competence, but we are working on talent partnerships, on skills packages with third countries, so that people come and also go back, because there's also brain drain in third countries. We need to be aware of that. So successful integration projects, I think they're local, they do exist. I'm, as you can hear from my accent, German, so I know from a few successful projects there in my local neighborhood there. We have people who came in the wave in the 70s from Europe, Southern European states that have been very successfully integrated. We have a lot of people from Turkey and Germany who are also, not all, but a large majority successfully integrated. But it takes the will on both sides and honesty and transparency about what is expected from each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Logothetis.
Yeah, I will just add one word. It's the word trust. So we have honesty, transparency, and trust in between us. So if we establish procedures and we actually learn to share the burden and understand that there are certain capacities that can be actually overwhelmed by numbers, because you might have a very successful integration program in a village in Germany, but this program will have a capacity that if it is overwhelmed, it will end up as a disaster, and people that you would see helping people coming in to integrate at the beginning, then will be on the streets fighting for no more people because they have a certain capacity. So I think that honesty and trust, and of course transparency and procedures, and a little bit of less political exaggeration on the impact of migration on both sides, or the humanitarian exaggeration about leverage and manipulation of the masses. I think that all these, if they are put with honesty and trust on the table, will lead to an end result that will be that we, of course, as Europe, we are going to have to deal with this phenomenon for a long time forward, but we can actually find a really streamlined and sustainable way to deal with this issue. As Beate said, there is the capacity from the European states to find a sustainable solution, but there is also a certain capacity on that. Thank you very much, my lord.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you too very much indeed for that. Finally, perhaps I could ask each of the two speakers a very brief question. Firstly, Mrs. Minder, you were able to support relocations also to non-EU countries. How do you see opportunities? How do you see the opportunities to enlarge?
Lord, there is a problem in the connection.
Medical doctor, you have seen this in Greek camps, but Mrs. Minder, perhaps you might respond first.
I'm afraid there was a technical issue, the classic, and I didn't get the question because the line was very, very bad. Can you repeat?
Let me repeat. Let me repeat it. Ms. Minder, you were able to support relocations also to non-EU countries. How do you see the opportunities to enlarge this scope?
Well, we have non-EU countries that are at the same time very closely cooperating with the EU. So Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, they are part of the European Economic Area, and therefore they have already a privileged way of working with us. Not always easy relations, but largely successful. So I think for those countries, they will continue to be part of it. Other countries, like perhaps real third countries like the US or the UK, because you're not yet part of the economic area, unfortunately, and not part any longer of the EU, unfortunately. I think, you know, it would be very helpful if you could also contribute and continue to contribute, because particularly on resettlement, you were one of the biggest contributors and supporter from the European Union. But how this technically works with our relationships, I'm not the best person to reply that, but in terms of content, it would be for the help of people, certainly something that would be appreciated.
Well, thank you. Mr. Logothaitis.
My lord, I did not have the chance to listen to your question at the first time as well.
Apologies for the technical difficulty. But Mr. Logothaitis, as a medical doctor, you have seen the suffering of migrants firsthand. How important is humanitarian assistance to migrants, and what would you see as the major humanitarian needs in Greek camps just now?
I will tell you what the biggest humanitarian challenge is. We see a lot of people and we do not actually know which of all these people need a humanitarian response from day one. Being a refugee or a migrant or a population at the move involves also a lot of storytelling that might not be true. So the biggest challenge in this humanitarian crisis is to recognize those that are in real need in comparison to people who actually found a way to visit Europe for many different purposes. So this is the biggest humanitarian challenge, and this is why I insist on procedures. It is really important to be there to recognize, and this builds trust in local populations and member states about what is actually going on. So this is the biggest challenge, and we need to exchange, and this is what we actually need currently, to exchange specialties and experiences in order to have one established way of dealing with it. Because if I have the Greek way, maybe the Greek way is being accused by the Italian way of not being that humanitarian. So we have to establish a baseline, a benchmark about the approach. So we all agree that this is what should be given and this should be the response, just to avoid the political harassment that we suffer many different countries in many different times. So I think this is the biggest support we need, to sit down on a table and discuss about humanitarian support within the borders of Europe.
Mrs. Minder and Mr. Logothaitis, thank you both very much indeed. Your work is most impressive and extremely important. This brings us to the conclusion of the conference, and for that difficult task, we are honoured to have Ambassador Drahoslav Stefanik, Special Representative on Migration and Refugees of the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, Mrs. Burek. Mr. Stefanik, may I invite you to give us your conclusions?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Best regards from Strasbourg, and thank you very much for this opportunity to address the conference. A year ago, on 19th June 2020, so it's almost exactly 1 year ago, the first of a series of 4 European web conferences started during the height of the COVID-19 lockdown, born out of an initiative of Lord Dundiel and Lord Dubs, when parliaments in Europe were suspended and closed for sessions because due to health protection, and migrants suffered tremendously under the situation and the closure of borders. And I'm very happy that the UK Parliament hosted these conferences in an excellent manner. But as I would like to also mention that it's not only conferences where you, Lord Dundee and Lord Dubs, have been active, but of course we all recall the famous and successful Dubs scheme relocating 480 child refugees into the UK. So it's not only conferences, but it's also practical deeds you have been involved in. I would like to thank you once again. Also within our cooperation with the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and its committee for your enthusiasm and personal dedication. I would briefly rewind the conclusions from what we have heard. I will start with Mr. Manos Logothetis from the Greek Ministry of Migration and Asylum, who gave us also the testimony and also his personal testimony because he was in the past not in Athens but present in the Greek islands about the challenges which they are facing especially in the Greek islands. Relocation is very important mechanism, crucial one, but also the fast and more efficient asylum procedures, as was mentioned by Mr. Logothetis. And he also made an interesting remark that we have now maybe more time to learn lessons from 2015-2016 crisis and to move also to the integration element of the overall, I would say, package concerning the human rights of refugees. Ms. Beate Gminder from the European Commission has very well complemented the statement by Mr. Logothetis by introducing 2 examples of relocations to schemes. One was more successful, which was implemented in Greece, and that's a positive example. And I'm also very happy that the European Commission works now on follow-up. And also, I would like to thank also on behalf of the Council of Europe and all others for the emergency funds and the funding which is provided by the European Union. Maybe the more challenging scheme was described in the Central Mediterranean based on the Malta Declaration. But I hope that the success will also come there, and more solidarity and more sharing will be shown also in that region in Mediterranean, because we see a number of increases of boat arrivals in Italy and of course also in Spain. In Greece, we have heard that 16 countries altogether participated in the relocation scheme. Out of those 16, there was 13 EU members. Then I would follow with Miss Sophie Weidenhiller of the NGO CI. She has portrayed quite a gloomy picture, and also she has mentioned that there is no progress as far as the search and rescue and saving the lives in the Mediterranean. And she mentioned there is 807 deaths so far registered, unfortunately, only this year. I would also say that the often politically overheated situation leads to political discussions instead of focus on saving lives at the sea. But I will come back to our main topic, main theme, which is the celebration of the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention. as the Earl of Kinnoul said, that the convention is 70 years young and not old. The conclusion and adoption of 1951 Refugee Convention was a great achievement in 1951, when Europe and the world had seen millions of persons displaced in the wake of the Second World War. While international humanitarian law has evolved since and now recognizes the targeted displacement of civilian population as a crime and crimes against humanitarian law, Europe still faces great political difficulties in providing international protection for refugees today. And Ms. Gillian Triggs, whom I had honor and pleasure to meet last year in October in Geneva, described the huge efforts done by the UNHCR every day in Europe as well as in the regions bordering Europe. But we also heard that the huge number and larger number of refugees are hosted in developing world. She mentioned example of Bangladesh, who is, I think, among the least developing countries, the so-called LDCs, hosting 1 million refugees originating especially from Myanmar. So what we are receiving in Europe is only a small portion, actually, in comparison with the developing world, and we should also bear this in mind. I would also mention the statement by Agnes Kalamar, the new Secretary General of Amnesty International, which celebrates the 60th anniversary, and it's its headquarters in London, where we are actually meeting virtually today. She mentions 3 issues very pertinent, also in my everyday agenda. One is pushbacks, which is the practice definitely contrary to the 1951 Refugee Convention, but also I should mention that it's contrary to the European Convention on Human Rights, especially in particular Article 3, and also it's violating the Article 4 of the Protocol 4 to the European Convention on Human Rights concerning the collective expulsions. Then second notion or phenomenon, quite recent phenomenon, was mentioned: outsourcing or externalization of the asylum procedures. And the third, it was criminalization of activities of humanitarian actors, or criminalization of humanitarian activities in general. Those are all very pertinent issues, and I think maybe the most topical ones now present in Europe. But the conference today, like this one, tries to initiate more European awareness and action and solidarity, of course, which I would like to again underline. Also, what I would like to mention is that there was some remarks concerning that one thing is speaking at the conferences or addressing the international forums. Second thing, the other thing is to go to the ground and to the places and to help refugees and people on the move. And also, I would like to mention my visits this year, my missions to Bosnia and Herzegovina in January, where I spent 10 days and visiting all reception centers, including then quite famous reception center Lipa. And also I spent 2 weeks almost in Turkey in March, also traveling all around the country, including the border with Syria. And I can also underline what was mentioned by Beate Gminder and Mr. Logothetis. We need trust, we need honesty, and quite often when I have spoken to a number of people in these camps and centers, they have very false expectations, and really they are expecting to enter the paradise, and the reality, unfortunately, is much worse. Once again, thank you very much for this excellent conference. I have been listening and following it since the very beginning, and I will do it until the very end. Once again, I congratulate Lord Dundee and Lord Dubs for this initiative and for the active involvement of the UK Parliament. And I would like to also maybe finish by a lighter note that I wish you that you all enjoy in the UK the tonight derby, England-Scotland, within the European Championship, and I will enjoy it as well as a humble observer. Thank you very much once again.
Mr. Stefanik, all of us will be very grateful to you for these concise but complete conclusions. I do not want to add anything to them other than to thank a great deal yourself and everyone else who's contributed to this outcome on the eve of World Refugee Day. I would now like to hand over to my co-chair of our conference, Lord Dubbs, who will present a call for action. Lord Dubbs.
Thank you, Alexander. I think it's been a terrific day. Sometimes when there are occasions like this, there's a question that is asked, what now? And it is to answer that question that I'm going to present a call for action on World Refugee Day 2021. It is that call for action which we can take with us in the hope that the good things we've learned from the conference, and there are many, will then help us to take further action in our own spheres. So here goes. I think it's going to be put up on the screen eventually, at least I hope so. I'll wait till it comes up so that I don't, you can follow me as I read it through. Call for action on World Refugee Day 2021. Right. The technology, okay, here goes. On the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, hereafter called the Convention, and World Refugee Day, we, the co-chairs of the conference, reiterate the relevance of the Convention in addressing current-day humanitarian challenges and urge the member states of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly to abide by their obligations under the Convention, as well as the European Convention on Human Rights and the Helsinki Final Act, among others, and to lead by example by displaying greater solidarity towards persons fleeing armed conflicts, violence, or persecution. We cannot continue to let thousands of children, women, and men perish each year trying to reach safety or in search of a better life. We urge all member states of the Council of Europe and the OSCE to do their utmost to save lives at sea through enhanced search and rescue operations, as well as greater solidarity and responsibility sharing, leading to concrete support for transit countries and countries at the front line of irregular arrivals. We also ask ourselves whether the principle of first safe country of arrival, on which our asylum systems are based, and which has resulted in the overburdening of a handful of frontline countries, is appropriate within the context of current migration patterns, and whether it is not, in fact, against the spirit of the 1951 Convention. We agree there is a need to better protect people seeking asylum in Europe and the wider OSCE area through improved asylum procedures, so that applicants receive prompt decisions, enabling them to rebuild their lives either in their new host countries or back home, having returned in a safe and dignified manner, in full respect of the principle of non-refoulement. When applicants cannot be returned to their home country, we ask whether alternative measures could be taken so that persons found not to be in need of international protection do not languish for years in return centres and can nevertheless contribute to society and lead a dignified life while their return is pending. We are deeply concerned by the substantiated reports of violent pushbacks of migrants and asylum seekers and other serious human rights violations occurring at our borders. Recalling the 1951 Convention, which stipulates that subject to specific exceptions, refugees should not be penalized for illegal entry or stay, we urge all member states of the Council of Europe and the OSCE to respect the right to seek asylum, to refrain from collective returns, to assess each case individually with special attention to the identification of vulnerable categories of migrants, such as unaccompanied children, or potential victims of human trafficking or torture, and to implement effective human rights border monitoring procedures to strengthen accountability. At the same time, we call upon the Council of Europe and OSCE member states to sustain efforts to dismantle criminal networks which profit from smuggling and trafficking in human beings, and to offer expanded, safe and legal pathways for persons in need of international protection through, inter alia, education programs for child refugees and other vulnerable migrants, resettlement and family reunification programs, so that it is those with the greatest needs rather than those with the greatest mobility who are granted refugee status. Recognizing the individual challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, we nevertheless underline the need to ensure that mitigation measures do not stigmatize migrant and refugee communities and do not have a disproportionately negative impact on them. We furthermore urge the provision of equal access to basic healthcare for all refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, and their inclusion in national vaccination programs regardless of legal status. In order to meet these challenges, we call upon the Council of Europe and the OSCE to reinforce their institutional capacity and preparedness. We ask the Council of Europe to consider the possible expansion of the mandate of the Special Representative on Migration and Refugees of the Council of Europe Secretary General, bearing in mind the new Council of Europe Action Plan for Protecting Vulnerable Persons in the context of Migration and Asylum in Europe 2021-2025, adopted on the 5th of May 2021. We also call upon the OSCE to adopt a new decision regarding the OSCE's role in the governance of large movements of migrants and refugees, broadening the mandate and activities of its recently appointed senior migration security expert. Finally, we strongly urge the relevant PACE and OSCE PA migration committees to work towards the implementation of the above recommendations and call upon the Council of Europe and OSCE member states to cooperate in sharing responsibility for the protection of and assistance to refugees and asylum seekers, to move towards agreed standards and practices, and engage in concerted action in close partnership with other relevant international and regional actors, including UNHCR and IOM, as well as civil society and refugees and asylum seekers themselves. And that is presented by the two co-chairs on behalf of this conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All of us can wholeheartedly endorse this timely call for action. World Refugee Day, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the 1951 Refugee Convention, is a special moment where we should reflect on what we can do to make the world more humane for those who are in distress and need our support. With this hope, I thank everyone and close the conference. The audio-visual recording of this conference will be made available on the internet soon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.